All right, good morning, everyone. This is Nick Schlag with E3. I think we'll go ahead and get this webinar started. Wanted to say welcome everybody at the outset of this to this public webinar. We're really excited today to bring to you the results of our latest work on resource adequacy in the desert Southwest region. This is a project we've been involved in for the past roughly 9 months, and we're really excited to be able to share with you all what we feel like we've learned through the work that we've done in this space today. So thank you all for joining. We hope today's content is as interesting for you guys as it has been for us to learn about. I'm joined by my colleague, Adrian, who will be sharing the presentation roles with me today. So we'll be transitioning at a few points throughout this presentation. But before we dive into content for today, I've got a couple just logistics to get out of the way. So first things, we've got roughly an hour of prepared content for today's presentation, covering the motivation behind why we've done this study, the methods and assumptions that have gone into it, the results, and ultimately what we've found from this work. We've got roughly half an hour earmarked at the end of this time available for questions and sort of a more open Q&A session as to what this work implies, what it all means, etc. So we'll be taking questions via the chat function as we go, and I'm happy to kind of adjust our timing if questions are coming in live. But just keep in mind that that's kind of the general cadence that we're shooting for with this presentation. Now, we have posted our final report and the associated technical appendices on our website this morning. So that's available at the link that you guys can find here, e3.com/publication. And I think we'll try to send out an email if we can after the webinar with the links to these as well, so that folks who want to dig deeper into this content can take a look there. We do have a lot of folks on this webinar, and so we're going to keep folks on mute throughout the course of the webinar, but we will welcome you or invite you all to share your questions via the Q&A functionality that you can find in the WebEx app. So at the very bottom right of your screen, you should be able to find hopefully a Q&A button, and if you click on that button, you'll be able to find this box where you can type in your questions. Again, feel free to drop questions in there as we go through this presentation. My colleague and E3 partner, Arnie Olson, will be monitoring this Q&A box and will be relaying your questions to me and to Adrian throughout the presentation as appropriate. So we'll be able to field some of these as we go and then take the rest at the end when we kind of open it up for the more formal Q&A. Maybe last note on logistics before we really dive into today's presentation is we are recording this webinar, so this will be available for folks to go back and review and watch for the first time or watch again if you're interested after we conclude this, and we'll find a way to link you guys up with the recording if you're interested in being able to take a look back at it. So I wanted to start just very briefly with a couple introductions and acknowledgments before we get into today's content. I think a lot of you guys are probably familiar with E3 and the work that we do. We're an energy consultancy based in San Francisco. We're roughly 100 people at this point, and we work pretty extensively across the industry, especially in the Western Interconnection, with a diverse range of clients that includes utilities, developers, government agencies, and environmental groups. And we work with all these different types of clients to answer what we think are the most interesting and pressing questions facing the energy sector today. Resource adequacy has become one of our favorite and most interesting topics that we've worked on. And we spent a lot of time over the past 5 to 10 years really diving deep on what it will take to maintain reliability and resource adequacy as part of the course of our transition towards a deeply decarbonized electricity system. So we've listed here a couple of the studies that we've done over the past couple of years that relate to this space of work. Maybe notably on the far left here, you can see our work in the Pacific Northwest several years ago, in which we examined a similar set of questions to what you'll see today, where we ultimately identified a significant gap in the region's sort of capacity planning efforts that in part helped inform where we've landed today with respect to the genesis of the Western Resource Adequacy Program and an effort to better pool resources to meet the needs of the Northwest. So feel free, once we circulate this presentation, to take a deeper dive into these. In addition to these broader sorts of policy studies, we've also worked directly with a number of utilities throughout the West to work on developing robust frameworks for them to manage their own resource adequacy needs, which has been an interesting exercise for us as well. Wanted to acknowledge a few folks before we also get into this work. First is wanted to thank the study's sponsors. The work that you see today was funded by a coalition of 6 different utilities, which includes the Arizona Electric Power Cooperative, Arizona Public Service, El Paso Electric, the Public Service Company of New Mexico, Salt River Project, and Tucson Electric Power. So we're very grateful to these utilities for having come together to fund this work that we found really interesting to be a part of. At this point, I think Jeff Burke, Director of APS Resource Planning, I think you're on the line, and I'd like to invite you to step in if you can come off mute and say a few words as to APS's perspective on why you wanted to see this work done and why you think this is important for the region.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I really appreciate the opportunity. And I wanted to say good morning to everybody and thank them all for taking all of their time out of their day to be with us for this presentation. And I'd really like to thank all the folks on this screen in particular for their hard work and contributions to this project. There were numerous discussions amongst the working groups, our review groups, and industry experts to make sure the results of the study were meaningful, accurate, and informative. There's a lot of good, interesting information that we're about to present, and I want to also thank E3 because they brought this all together in developing the project. So thanks to
Great, thanks so much, Jeff. And I'll just reiterate our thanks to the utilities for funding this work, but I'll also emphasize that, you know, the content that you see here, the analysis that we've done, this is really an E3 study. We certainly relied on utilities to provide inputs and assumptions to help us characterize their systems. But at the end of the day, the findings that you see here and the conclusions that we've drawn from this really reflect E3's view as to the future of resource adequacy within the Southwest. Now, Jeff already kind of acknowledged the technical advisory group that you see here on the right, but I also wanted to say thanks to these folks. This group of folks graciously volunteered their time over the course of this effort and met with us on several occasions to help us make sure that the methods and practices we were following were consistent with emerging best practices within the industry, gave us feedback on the results we were starting to see, and helped us really shape and hone the messages that we pulled away from this work. So even though these are our findings and we didn't ask the technical group to sign off on these as their own, we still are really appreciative to all of these folks for helping us make this work, I think, as useful as it could be. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the motivation and the purpose behind this work, essentially why we think this is so important. So in the past several years, we've seen several very dramatic and ultimately tragic examples of rolling blackouts in the electric grids of California and Texas. And these events have essentially served as warnings or reminders to us of what can go wrong if utilities fail to plan appropriately for the reliability risks in their systems. But both of these events also exemplify how planning for reliability is becoming more complex. In both of these cases, the blackouts that we saw, they occurred at times of day or times of year that are different from what you might traditionally expect, different from the traditional peak period. And there's now a widespread understanding across the industry that our efforts to plan for reliability actually have to encompass vulnerabilities that exist at all times of day and all times of year, not only just during the peak periods. But what's maybe vexing about this all is that just as planning for reliability is becoming more complex, we see it also becoming increasingly important. We know electricity is a basic necessity in our everyday lives, but as the frequency of extreme weather events increases with climate change, our ability to keep our home cool in the summer and warm in the winter is more than just a matter of convenience or comfort. It's a basic necessity. It's an essential service. And also, with the imperative to electrify transportation and buildings that comes along with an economy-wide effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to mitigate the impacts of climate change, we see a reliable electricity system really as the linchpin to any successful effort to deeply decarbonize the economy. So in light of the increasing complexity and the increasing importance of reliability planning, we're seeing many people ask questions as to whether the industry's current approaches to planning for resource adequacy are well suited to the future challenges that we envision ourselves confronting. These are hard questions for sure, but they're the right questions to be asking, and it's the right time to be asking them. So it's with these types of questions in mind that the utilities that we mentioned a minute ago asked E3 to conduct an assessment of resource adequacy in the Southwest region. For the purposes of our study, we've defined a geographic scope that includes the 6 major balancing authorities that you see here on the map to the right. These balancing authorities, they correspond to the service territories of our sponsors, but in addition, they include a number of smaller utilities and cooperatives that we include in this study for the sake of getting a full regional view. So ultimately, the scope of our analysis spans the states of Arizona and New Mexico, and also includes some small portions of neighboring states that are located within these balancing authorities. So with this geographic scope as our focus, the purpose of our assessment of resource adequacy, we really began it with three purposes in mind. The first of these was just to examine the current situation within the Desert Southwest region in light of the challenges we've seen in neighboring regions and identify any immediate risks or threat to reliability. Number 2 was to take a broad view on the literature out there and characterize best practices for resource adequacy planning in a way that we think can provide utilities with a robust foundation or framework to plan their own systems to meet the future challenges we expect to see. And the third purpose that we had in mind was to actually take those same best practices and apply those in a technical analysis to look at essentially how we might view the evolution of resource adequacy across the region over the course of the next decade. But you might think really underneath this all is a much more basic and singular and ultimately important question that's kind of motivating this study, which is the question of, do we think we'll be able to keep the lights on over the course of the next decade? Now, our study's focus is specifically on resource adequacy, and I'd like to be as specific as I can with that because resource adequacy is just one specific aspect of utilities' efforts to plan and operate a reliable grid. Utilities have reliability standards for planning and operating infrastructure that span across the generation, transmission, and distribution systems, and resource adequacy is just one dimension of this. So resource adequacy refers to the ability of a portfolio of generation resources to meet load across a wide range of system conditions that account for reasonable variability of supply and demand. So here, when we talk about variability of supply and demand, we're thinking about things like extreme weather, which could cause your loads to be higher than you might have expected. We're thinking about unplanned power plant outages that might cause some of your resources to be available when you need them. And we're thinking about things like how meteorological conditions can affect the output patterns of resources like wind and solar. Most electricity systems today are planned to a standard of resource adequacy that's intended to ensure that these types of shortfalls of supply are very rare, and the blackouts that may result are very rare events. So the most typical standard that you'll hear of in the industry, and the one that we've applied in this study, is the 1 day in 10-year standard, which implies that on average, we'd expect to see 1 day of loss of load over each 10-year period due to insufficient supply. Now, if you find yourself thinking, hey, my power's gone out quite a bit more than that over the past 10 years, that may be true. But I'd ask you to keep in mind that, once again, resource adequacy is just one element of reliability planning. And in fact, there are many other causes of power outages that you might experience, including things like power lines going down, faults on the distribution system. And it's in fact because our standards for resource adequacy are so stringent that the events like what we've seen in California and Texas over the past couple of years have actually been so rare over the past few decades. Now, I've alluded to the idea that the next decade, we expect it to be a dynamic one, and this is especially true in the Southwest. But what are the specific changes that we expect to see within the region? We've identified 6 trends that we think are going to really fundamentally reshape the resource adequacy needs and dynamics within this region over the next 10 years. And I wanted to spend a second just kind of walking you through each of these different pieces. So the first among these is growing loads. We see utilities within the region projecting high levels of load growth, and this is due to a combination of factors that includes net migration to the region, electrification of vehicles and transportation, and the addition of new large economic development loads. And this growth is large enough that even after we consider the future impacts of energy efficiency and behind the meter solar PV, we see utilities projecting a growth rate upwards of 2% within the region over the course of the next decade. At the same time, many of the region's utilities have now developed plans to retire some of the aging coal and natural gas generators within the region. The retirements of these types of resources, in particular the coal resources, is certainly an important step towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions within the electricity system within this region. But it's also going to reduce the capability of the existing system to meet future reliability needs, and this is an important dynamic to consider. Third is we expect to see a rapid increase in utilities' deployment of resources like renewables, storage, and distributed energy resources. In keeping with trends that we're seeing throughout the country, the deployment of these types of resources is being driven by a combination of policy, customer preferences, voluntary commitments made by utilities, and economics. Now, this is particularly important because each of these resources looks different or performs differently from conventional resources like nuclear, coal, and natural gas. And we'll need to think about how each of these resources contribute to resource adequacy differently because of that. Now, all 3 of these changes that we've discussed so far are occurring against a backdrop of a changing climate. And the fact is, we're seeing more frequent and more extreme hot weather events in the summers that have a direct impact on utilities' future needs. But this also represents an unknown, as there's uncertainty in the types of weather events that we might expect over the next decade. Even as the best climate science can tell us, there's still some uncertainty in this respect. Closely linked to the impacts of climate change is the risk of sustained drought. A number of the utilities within the region today rely on hydroelectric facilities to supply some of their needs, but if drought conditions become more severe than they are today, their ability to rely on these types of resources may be diminished. And the final trend that I'll highlight here is one that's maybe a little bit broader than just applicable to the Southwest region specifically, but stepping back a little bit, all 5 of these impacts that we've discussed so far are really playing out to varying extents across all the corners of the Western interconnection. We're seeing changes in loads and resources that are fundamentally reshaping the dynamics of Western electricity markets. And these changes in neighboring grids will have implications for when energy is available, at what price, and in what quantities. And as the entire Western interconnection comes closer to the edge of load resource balance, the margin for error in our assessments of resource adequacy becomes increasingly slim. Now, I did want to dig a little bit deeper into one of these before we go into the study formally, which is the dynamics that we expect to see with increasing levels of renewables and storage, because these resources will undoubtedly make important contribution to utilities' future needs, but they also make things more complex fundamentally. Let's take solar as a first example. Adding solar to an electricity system provides capacity value because it produces generation during the peak period, typically in the late afternoon in the Southwest. But as we add more solar to the system, what we start to see is that we change fundamentally the shape of the net load. And when I say net load, I'm talking about total load minus the output of the solar resources. As we get to higher and higher penetrations of solar, what we see is that the timing of the net peak actually shifts into the evening when solar is no longer able to produce. And as a result of this effect, what we see is that as we increase the penetration of solar in an electricity system, the timing of the greatest reliability risk actually shifts to that net peak period. This is exactly the dynamic that we saw in California in the August 2020 blackouts. Now let's take a look at storage, which is an example of what we call an energy limited resource. We call it energy limited because it can only deliver power to the grid for a finite length of time before its state of charge is depleted and before it needs to be recharged. Storage can be dispatched to meet the peak here, and it's flexible in that respect. But as we add more of it to the portfolio, what we'll find is that we'll eventually need resources capable of producing over longer and longer time frames. And what this in turn means is that there are actually fundamentally practical limits on how much we can rely on resources with limited duration to meet resource adequacy needs. So the natural next question that I'm sure many of you have in your minds is what happens when we combine these two things? And the result that we find here is actually a really interesting one and important for this region specifically. In effect, what we see is that a portfolio of solar and storage resources together are actually complementary to one another. In short terms, the whole of this portfolio actually produces more than the sum of its parts. This is because as solar changes the shape of the net load, it can actually allow us to use the energy storage more effectively to meet the remaining needs. So what this means fundamentally is that when we're studying resource adequacy, we have to consider a portfolio of resources as a whole in order to get the correct answer. So with this as a little bit of background, I wanted to give you a sneak peek of our key findings before we jump into the details of today's presentations. And we'll circle back on these at the end and discuss each one in a little bit more depth. So we've got 5 key findings for you. And again, we'll come back to these in more detail. But number 1 is that load growth and resource retirements are creating an urgent and significant need for new resources in the Southwest. And the region's ability to maintain reliability over the next decade will really hinge fundamentally on whether utilities can add resources at a rate to match these growing needs. Second, utilities' long-term plans have identified enough new resources to actually maintain reliability over this period. But as we'll see, it's not only the quantity of the resources that are important here, but what types as well. That leads us to our third finding from this work, which is that we find that a significant share of the region's future long-term resource adequacy needs can be met by a combination of solar and storage resources. Our analysis shows that this combination of resources is particularly well suited to meeting the high loads on summer peak days. But the flip side to this is that even as the penetration of solar and storage grow, we find that the region's remaining firm resources, in particular its nuclear and natural gas resources, will be absolutely needed to maintain reliability over this period. And finally, I think it's really important to be conscious of the sources of uncertainty in our work and to recognize that alongside these technical findings, there are a number of risks to resource adequacy that will remain as we move forward in the next decade. And we'll talk more specifically about what we think those risks are as we get deeper into this.
Nick, we had our first technical question just to clarify the load growth assumption. Is the 2% load growth annually or over the 10-year period?
Great, appreciate that question. That's a load growth, an annual load growth number, so it's just over 2% annual load growth. Thanks for the question.
And there were also a couple of questions about whether the webinar is being recorded and whether the slides will be available, and the answer to both of those questions is yes.
Thanks, Arnie. So with that background on this work and why we've done it, I'm going to move on now to talk more specifically about the analysis that we've conducted in this study. So I'm going to start by providing an overview of the scope of the technical analysis that we've done. Essentially, what we've tried to do here is answer 3 questions that we view as fundamental to the question of maintaining resource adequacy. Number 1, as a starting point, is just a simple question of how much capacity do we need over the next 10 years to maintain reliability in the Southwest when we measure against a 1-day and 10-year standard. Number 2, to what extent will utilities' existing and committed resources satisfy this need for capacity? And then number 3, what additional resources will we need to make sure that the region as a whole can maintain reliability? Now, in order to answer these questions, this study builds directly upon the regional utilities' integrated resource plans. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these types of plans, but these are basically efforts by the utilities to develop long-term plans that balance objectives that relate to cost, sustainability, and reliability. So our study here relies on the outputs of those plans as inputs, which we use to develop projections of the loads and resources of the Southwest region. We then analyze the utilities plans in aggregate through the very specific lens of resource adequacy, using loss of load probability modeling to calculate statistical metrics like loss of load expectation and a range of other outputs. But more on this in a second. Our analysis takes a regional perspective to this question, which is to say that we don't examine whether each individual utility is well positioned to meet its own needs, but we think this regional perspective is really useful because it provides us a broad view of what we might expect over the course of the next decade within the region. But it is important here to keep a few things in mind. One is that by taking this regional view, we make a number of simplifying in our assumptions. In our work that are, I think, important to keep in mind in the context of individual utilities plans. So for instance, we assume that there are no internal transmission constraints within the region or transactional friction that would prevent the sharing of resources. And these types of assumptions make this in some ways an optimistic view as to the level of reliability we might expect to see. Second is that while we think that the general findings and trends paint a picture of what we might expect to see over the course of the next decade, ultimately just want to recognize that at this point, each utility is responsible for planning to meet its own resource adequacy needs. And we would expect each utility to make those choices based on their own standards for resource adequacy, as well as the characteristics of their own loads and resources. So we mentioned loss of load probability modeling just a second ago, and I wanted to say a few words about what that is and why we think it's the essential foundation for any robust assessment of resource adequacy in the future. What we've tried to map out here is how we see best practices sort of emerging for resource adequacy analysis, but this is also kind of a blueprint for the practices that we've followed within this study. So LOLP modeling, if you don't know it, refers to a type of model that uses information around the probabilities of various events to simulate whether there will be enough supply to meet demand across a broad range of conditions. LOLP models are the gold standard for reliability modeling. They provide the most robust and the most direct means of measuring the resource adequacy of a system. Today's LOLP models have advanced significantly since their origins in the mid-20th century, but the fundamental principles around which those models have been built remain really sound and fundamental to our assessments of adequacy. But many of the tools we have today have actually incorporated significant new functionality and have advanced our understanding of the challenges we face. Now, we can use an LOLP model to measure whether a specific system meets a desired level of reliability, but we can also use it as the foundation for a capacity accounting framework, where we can identify a capacity need in megawatts and stack up resources against that requirement. The first step to doing this is what we call need determination, where we use an LOLP model to identify the amount of capacity that we need to meet an acceptable standard of reliability. Through this process, we can identify an appropriate planning reserve margin that's calibrated against a statistical standard for reliability, say the 1-day and 10-year standard. Now, the third step goes hand in hand with the second, and that's what's really important here is how we count capacity towards this requirement. Here we rely on a metric called effective load carrying capability, or ELCC, which essentially measures the contribution of each resource towards that need relative to a perfect capacity resource that's available in all hours of the year at full capacity. ELCC is a really powerful metric that comes out of the very same LOLP model. And when properly applied, it can account for all of the natural and expected complications that we expect to see over the course of the next decade, including dynamics like the shift to the net peak, the need to account for energy sufficiency in addition to capacity, and the saturation and effects and diversity benefits that come along with a portfolio of energy limited and renewable resources. So for this reason, we view ELCC really as the cornerstone to a robust approach for resource adequacy planning. So the blueprint that you saw on the slide above, sorry, wrong slide. The blueprint you saw on the slide above is essentially the method that we've followed in our work here. And the model that we've used to do this is our recap LOLP model, which is a model that we've designed and built over the course of the past decade with the intent of focusing specifically on the types of challenges that we expect to see in a highly renewable electricity system. So recap studies the electricity system on an hourly basis to identify any periods where the resources available to the system may be insufficient to meet loads. It does this while accounting for the hour-to-hour variations of renewable resources. It accounts for the outage, the impact of outages on plants like nuclear, coal, and natural gas. And it accounts for the hour-to-hour dispatch of energy-limited resources like storage, hydro, and demand response. One of the features of recap that's especially important that we're seeing become industry standard is that it's a chronological simulation, meaning that it steps through time hour by hour, which we think is fundamentally necessary to get the right answer when we're thinking about complex resources like storage, whose availability depends on how you use them in prior periods. Now, with this type of analysis, we're searching for needle in a haystack types of events, things that occur once in 10 years. So if you took a model like this and you simulated the system for just 1 year, there's a good chance you wouldn't find any problems at all. In fact, if you simulated it for 10 years, there's even a chance at that point that you might not identify any threats to reliability. What we find is we actually have to cycle through conditions over the course of essentially 1,000 years in order to discern a meaningful signal from a model like this. So we simulate 1,000 years worth of conditions in order to get a good answer to the question of how frequent, how large, and how long would potential reliability events last. And these same simulations allow us to derive a planning reserve margin for the system and calculate the ELCCs of the resources within it. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Adrian, to share a little bit with you guys about some of the more detailed assumptions around our scenarios that we've used this tool to analyze, and then to walk you through some of our high-level results before taking it back to circle back to our key findings. Adrian?
Thank you, Nick. And Adrian, before we make the transition, there's been a couple of questions that have popped up in the chat. First one is whether the study will comment on the appropriateness of the 1 day and 10-year planning standard.
Thanks, I appreciate this question. We're not going to spend time in today's presentation discussing the 1 day and 10-year standard. That's just kind of been industry standard, and it's what we've relied on for this analysis. We do in our report include a much more extensive discussion around best practices with respect to resource adequacy today and in the future, and in there include some discussion around potential future alternatives to the 1 day and 10-year standard. So if that's a question that you're interested in, I'd point you to the report to dig in a little bit deeper.
Okay, secondly, can you please contrast the algorithms in recap with SERVM or running Plexos or some production cost model probabilistically?
Yeah, this is a great question. We've actually worked directly with the folks at Astrape with their SERVM model in a number of projects, and we also have experience running Plexos within E3. At the bottom line, each of these models does some things a little bit differently, but they're fundamentally all trying to kind of conduct the same simulations, which is to say, conduct an hour-by-hour time sequential look at the state of reliability within the system based on outages to resources, patterns of load and renewable variability, and the dispatch of these types of energy-limited resources. So I don't want to spend too much time going into great depth today as to the specific algorithmic differences within these models, but these are fundamentally really all in the same family of model.
Okay, just a couple of more. The next one is, does the model capture potential fuel shortages like the fossil gas shortages we saw during the Texas outages last winter? And how does that affect the classification of a gas resource as, quote, firm?
Yep, so this is obviously a very relevant question, I think, given the events that we saw in Texas. The answer to this is that we don't represent fuel supply outages in a model like this. And the reason for that, and I'm sure many loss of load probability modeling practitioners can sympathize with this, is that these types of events are actually really difficult to represent in a probabilistic framework. We just don't have great data to characterize the risk of those types of events in terms of their probabilities, or if they do happen, the scale of their impact. This is another topic that we delve a little bit deeper into in our report, and so I'd point you there as well. But what we see is that there's an emerging area of reliability planning that many folks have described as resilience. And we see resilience as a fundamentally adjacent topic to resource adequacy, and it's one that's sort of better suited or better tuned to being able to look at the types of essentially catastrophic events like the ones that we saw in Texas. So again, I'll point you to our report for more detail on that.
Okay. And then just one more, there's been a couple of questions that came in about how we treat weather and climate change in the historical record. So I think I'm going to defer those. Adrian has a slide on those. But for the folks that ask those questions, if they aren't answered through Adrian's presentation, then we pop them back into the chat or into the Q&A. And then there are others coming in, but I think at this point we should move on and then return to those and get to the Q&A section at the end.
Okay, thanks, Arnie. So I'll hand it over to Adrian at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks, Arnie. As Nick mentioned, I'll be going through some of the model inputs very briefly. We run the risk of using the rest of our time if I delve into every single detail. So we'll try to keep this short and just enough so that we can ground ourselves within the context of our study results. We can bucket our modeling inputs into really two categories, loads and resources. We'll start with loads first. And what we've done in this study is relied on the utilities IRPs and their load growth assumptions. And we've taken those individual load growth assumptions and aggregated them up into one larger Southwest region. We wanted to note that we did not run a peak load forecast for this study. We wanted to have we wanted to perform an independent view on how the utilities are planning for themselves. So what we see here on the right is a chart that shows that peak load forecast. And on average, every year, we're seeing a 2.5% increase in peak load. And there are many reasons for that. Some of them we've listed here, like net migration or adoption of electric vehicles and new loads coming into the region, also offset by energy efficiency programs and customers generating their own electricity and managing their own energy through rooftop solar and batteries. We've also, anytime we do a forecast, look at the uncertainty in a future year. And this band around this line represents the uncertainty due to weather. In 2025, we may experience a mild weather or something more extreme. And so we've characterized and pulled two metrics out of this band. What we're calling a typical weather year, a 1 in 2 year, is represented by that number 1 in 2 peak. So that's the peak load that on a typical year that the Southwest would experience. On a more extreme year, for example, that happens once every 10 years, we could expect loads to be slightly higher. And we see that in that number. So picking a year out of this chart in 2025, just 3 years down the line, we see loads grow on a typical year to 26,000 megawatts. And on an extreme year, 27,800 megawatts. On the resource side, we've explored different versions of the portfolio, but again, relied mostly on the assumptions and plans that the utilities have developed. Again, because we wanted to provide an independent view on how they're planning to meet reliability. We start off with today and our system today in the Southwest. What we find is that the Southwest relies on a lot of conventional resources like that of natural gas, coal, and nuclear, with a small sliver coming from renewables and storage. If we add on into the future the committed resources, the resources that utilities have already signed for and contracted, what we find is that the renewable and storage portion grows. Just looking at solar alone, the amount of solar in the Southwest will double. But on top of all these committed resources, we also have resource retirements, as Nick mentioned. We're seeing the coal fleet diminish, and in 2025, we see some amount of it go away, and even more retire by 2033. So these represent the resources that the utilities have just signed, but we've also looked at what the utilities have planned for all the resources for these two snapshot years in 2025 and 2033. In just 3 years' time, we see that renewable and storage portion explode. In 2025, solar quadruples, and we're adding 3,500 megawatts of storage, and some amount of wind, and some amount of demand-side resources as well. By 2033, that only continues that trend. These are the base cases that we'll be exploring today in today's webinar, but we've also looked at other sensitivities to assess what the different levels of uncertainty that they could have in providing reliability to the system. Diving a little bit deeper into the inputs themselves, we wanted to show how this loss of load probability study deals with weather. As many of you know, when the climate will continue to change, and renewables are playing a larger role in our electric system. And to that means weather is playing a larger role in reliability. And so what we've done is to build a robust data set on connecting weather and resource adequacy. On the resource side, we looked at wind and solar, and to do that, we used the robust data sets provided by the National Renewable Energy Labs to simulate both an expanded temporal range of wind and solar outputs, but also to represent the geographic diversity of the region of these resources. On the load side, what we've tried to do is build that relationship between historical weather and historical loads. That way we can simulate what today's system would react to the 70 years of history and historical weather data available to us. In addition to building this correlation between weather, historical weather, and loads, we've taken that one step further to address climate change. As we know, as the climate continues to change, that also continues to change the way we think about historical loads. Historical weather. Typical LOLP studies rely on this assumption that the historical weather record can properly reflect today's system and maybe a future system as well. But with this increasing temperature that we see, we find that that assumption starts to break down. And so what we've done here, and shown here on the right as a very simplistic example of what we've done, is we've taken the historical data shown here in blue with the inclining trend. We've normalized that data to today's system, making sure that we bring historical weather, the historical temperatures, to today's climate regime. That way it gives us a good apples to apples comparison of what today and maybe the future's world holds compared to historical weather temperatures. That's just a really quick overview of all of our inputs. I think it's enough for today's webinar, but again, encourage our attendees to take a look at our report for all the gory details. But for now, I think we can move on to the study results, and we'll return back to the 3 questions that Nick posed up at the top. But the first one, simply, how much capacity is required to maintain reliability in the Southwest? What's good is that the loss of load probability modeling framework is actually very well equipped to answer this question. With all the different weather variations represented, we can ask ourselves how much capacity is required to meet this acceptable frequency of loss of load. What we find in the study is by 2025, the Southwest will require 30,200 megawatts of effective capacity. And by effective capacity, we mean this perfect resource that is 100% available to meet load at any given time. that requirement increases to 35,800 megawatts by 2033. And interestingly, these two numbers have a relationship to a typical year's peak load. If we take the ratio between these numbers over the peak load of a typical weather year, we find that it's 13% above the regional peak. In the study, we've also tried to understand the relationship between the frequency of loss load and the amount of effective capacity we have in the system. This chart on the right tries to illustrate the point that when we draw that red line, which is the acceptable frequency of loss load event, we find that 30,000 megawatts that I've mentioned earlier. But what happens if we're just shy of that target? Well, if we lose 500 megawatts of effective capacity in the system, we find that the loss of load frequency doubles. Lose another 500 and that doubles again. And we can see that that trend grows exponentially if we miss the reliability target. One other important note in this particular slide I want to make is that we've measured everything against measured reliability, I should say, against effective capacity across all our resources. And the reason why we've done that is because we've made it, we wanted to make this target technology agnostic, one that applies to all technologies, but resource specific on how effective that resource is to meeting incremental load. So with that, we now know how much we need to be reliable. We also we can now answer the question or ask the question on whether the currently contracted and committed resources that the utilities have satisfy the remaining reliability need. We'll start with today's system. And what we find is that with all the resources available to the Southwest, that it's more or less reliable. A couple megawatts short, but it's more or less reliable. We fast forward 3 years later and look at what the utilities have contracted. We find that the amount of solar, wind, storage, and demand-side resources contracted isn't enough to cover the retirements and load growth in the region. In fact, it leaves a capacity deficit of about 3.8 gigawatts. If we translate that back to that loss of load frequency, what we find is that this portfolio is unable to meet 12 days of the year, meaning that there are 12 days concentrated around the summertime that would expect lots of load events. Again, fast forward to the future to 2033, without additional contracted resources, that capacity deficit grows to 13.2 gigawatts. And again, this portfolio would be unable to meet 141 days, basically the whole summer in 2033. So there's clearly a dire need for an urgent need for more resources to meet load growth and retirements. But I think to understand how to close this capacity gap, we need to understand when the Southwest region needs energy most. I mentioned earlier that solar will provide most of the new resources in the committed portfolio. And Nick also mentioned the shift to the net peak. And I wanted to bring in what that means and the implications of when that loss of load probability occurs. Solar is really good at providing valuable clean energy in the midday, but as soon as the sun goes down, it's unable to provide energy. And what happens in the net peak when we go into this net peak planning regime, we find that the loss of load probability actually concentrates around this late evening period, exactly when solar isn't available. And so what we find is resources that can provide energy during that time in these hot summer evenings will be well positioned to provide additional capacity value for the resource for the system. So now that we understand the capacity deficit, that there is a capacity deficit and the timing of the need, we can answer the next question, which is, how do the remaining resources in the IRP portfolios aim to fill this capacity need? before we even answer that question, we wanted to highlight the role of solar and storage. And this is a simple thought exercise and where we explore if we try to just rely on these two resources to close that capacity deficit. We'll start with solar. What we've done is we've taken that 2025 existing and committed portfolio, pulled out the renewables and storage, and assessed how much effective capacity, again, by definition, 100% available resource to meet load, how much effective capacity this renewable and storage fleet has. And by 2025, the 6 gigawatts of solar and 2 gigawatts of solar storage wind and a couple hundred megawatts of demand response provide 3.6 gigawatts of effective capacity. If we layer on top just solar and rely on solar to close our capacity deficit, we find that even if you add as much as 40 gigawatts of solar, it's unable to close that gap. And that's due to the net peak regime that Nick and I have mentioned in previous slides. However, if we look at storage, it's a completely different picture. What we find here is storage is actually very well suited to meet the capacity needs in the near future. Its dispatchability and its ability to move energy around provides most of that value. Adding anywhere from 0 to 8 gigawatts provides a lot of capacity value for the region, but past 8 gigawatts, we see diminishing returns with increased penetration. I think I think there's really two main reasons why we see that. One is just the amount of energy you can store. If you only added storage resources, there still needs to be energy to supply those storage resources. But the second one also has to go back to the net peak shape that Nick had mentioned earlier, which is it's both widening and flattening that time of need. And with short duration, like 4-hour batteries, like we've modeled here, it widens so far past the duration that it's unable to continue curbing the peak. But that interesting dynamic of having both solar and storage shows up in capacity value. Again, Nick mentioned that the combination of solar and storage provides more capacity value than the sum of its parts. And that's represented here by this green wedge. And to understand why that green wedge appears, we go back to those two reasons that I mentioned. Solar answers the problem that storage doesn't have enough energy to just charge from. But secondly, as you add more solar into the net peak, what happens is that it continues to narrow that evening peak, so much so that it allows a column of energy that the storage can then fill in. So now that we understand how these two resources can meet the reliability needs of the region, we can now turn to the remaining resources in the IRP portfolios. Again, with today's world, we're around reliable. Fast forward to 3 years, if we added both the committed resources and whatever the utilities are planning to add, we find that it's sufficient enough. These renewables and storage and demand-side resources are actually sufficient enough to meet reliability, so much so that it covers both the load growth and retirements. More good news in 2033 is with the continued expansion of these resources, we find that the capacity deficit is closed, that 13.2 gigawatts of it is closed. Again, enough to cover both load growth and retirements. So in summary, if we look at how the resources progress, we find that starting in 2021, with the system mostly reliant on conventional resources, that transformation 11 years down the line will see a massive growth of renewables and storage. Around 38 gigawatts will come online between now and then. That if the utilities manage to build all that's been planned, then renewables and storage will make up 67% of the total portfolio in 2033. those same resources will provide around half of the effective capacity in the region, but existing conventional resources provide the remaining capacity. But by 2033, Southwest customers will be consuming consuming electricity from a much cleaner grid. Around 70% of 2033's electricity will be carbon free, so long as the utilities keep up with their plans and continue these plans to build all the resources that they've shown in the IRPs. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Nick to go through a discussion of our key findings.
Adrian, just a couple of quick clarifying questions before you pass it back to Nick. So one is, does the 3.8 gigawatts and 13.2 gigawatts represent needs above what the utilities are currently planning to procure? I think you probably answered this one, but maybe just to emphasize.
Yeah, so those gaps represent, so I think those gaps represent if the utilities didn't contract or sign any more resources and just left the existing system and whatever they've got planned in 2025, 2033 as is, then there would be a remaining 3.8 gigawatts in 2025 and 13.2 in 2033. But of course, in the IRPs, we've seen now that they aim to close that gap with a mixture of renewables and storage.
Thank you. And then a question of whether this is 4-hour storage being shown or what's the duration?
Yeah, well, in the existing and planned resources that the IRPs have shown, it's actually a mixture of a duration, some as short as 1 or 2, up to about 5. But what we've modeled here, incremental to the system to assign an ELCC, is 4-hour duration.
Great.
But maybe just to clarify further on that, Adrian, in terms of the storage resources in the IRP portfolios, this is actually an area where we've relied on the utilities to help us out, and there's a diversity of durations represented within there, from the 1 to 2 to 4 hours that Adrian mentioned, all the way up to 8 to 12 hours for a portion of that.
Thanks, Nick.
Another just quick technical question. What are you assuming for contingency reserve requirements in the PRM?
Great question. So on top of the system load, we assumed a 7.5% operating reserve.
Great. Were the studies based on net load or gross load basis? It looks like the question here is referring to what's at the customer meter, not on the system-wide basis.
Yeah, great question. Those 1 and 2 peaks and 1 and 10 peaks that we've measured are metered load, so that's, I guess, net load. But we've in our simulation, we tried to gross that back up by looking at historical behind the meter penetration and run that through a neural network model to simulate gross load. Then we add those behind the meter resources on the supply side, but treat them as demand resources so that we can understand those dynamics in the net load through our study. Great question.
Yeah, that would just be for behind the meter PV, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, I think the rest of the questions we're going to defer, not that we're trying to avoid them. I think they're just better addressed in the Q&A section. So why don't we move on, and then we'll come back to them.
Great, thanks, Arnie.
Okay, thanks, Arnie and Adrian. And I'll try to be relatively quick circling back on these key findings because we've talked about a lot of these in some form or fashion at this point in the presentation. But I did want to circle back to the key findings that we previewed for you all. You'll recall that our first finding from this work has been that load growth and resource retirements are creating an urgent need for new resources in the Southwest. Our work here indicates that existing resources within the utilities portfolios, plus the resources they've signed contracts with to date for new resources, will not be sufficient to meet their needs by 2025, and actually perhaps before. What we find is by that time, an additional 4,000 megawatts of effective capacity would be needed to ensure reliability, And keep in mind, we're talking right now in effective capacity. So that's a measurement of the amount of capacity you'd need if you were filling it with a perfect resource. But since we don't have perfect resources, the total amount of installed capacity will be larger. So the diagram on the right-hand side of this slide shows you how the various pieces break down to create this need. Essentially, we're starting with a system that's roughly in balance in 2021, but kind of right on the edge. And then we see load growth plus the resource retirements drive that need for new resources upwards of 5,000 megawatts. The existing, or rather the committed resources with which utilities have signed contracts knock a dent in that and bring it down to roughly 4,000. But that 4,000 megawatts of need beyond that remains. What this fundamentally means is that over the next few years, the ability of this system to maintain reliability will fundamentally depend on utilities' abilities to bring new resources online quickly enough as this gap grows on a year-by-year basis. Now, what's perhaps even more daunting about this is that this trend does not end in 2025. It's just the beginning. With the continuation of load growth through the decade, plus the larger amounts of coal retirements that are scheduled for the late 2020s and early 2030s, we find that the gap increases to the 13,000 megawatt figure that you heard Adrian report just a minute ago. And so what this means is we're looking at a decade of sustained need for new resource development. So our second finding then relates to how this gap might plausibly be filled to maintain regional resource adequacy. So at the right here, you see the stacks of all the resources that utilities have identified in their own plans to meet their future needs. And just as a reminder, these plans that they've developed are developed with multiple objectives in mind, which include not only the need to meet reliability requirements, but also with respect to optimizing around cost and meeting sustainability and policy objectives. So in the 2025 timeframe, we see in aggregate 14,000 megawatts of new nameplate capacity. And as Adrian pointed out, most of this is solar and storage. By 2033, this is a number that grows to 38,000 megawatts of nameplate capacity. And again, majority of this is solar and storage. So in our analysis, we found that these resources are sufficient to close those gaps that we just identified. But a couple of notes on this. First, if you're thinking that these nameplate capacities are much larger than the capacity gaps that we just showed you, that's very true. The reason for this difference is that we're showing nameplate capacity here, which represents the amount of steel in the ground. And that's much larger because a number of these resources actually provide very small levels of capacity value to the system. Second, we find it actually encouraging that these portfolios in aggregate produced a favorable reliability result for the region. I think it speaks to the notion that the planning methods and approaches currently in use within the region aren't really missing some major vulnerability. But I did want to return to the composition of these portfolios and dig a bit deeper into that because I think there's a really interesting story here when we think about the amount of solar and storage and other renewables and energy limited resources in these portfolios. Essentially, what you might note here is that by 2033, over 95% of the new nameplate capacity in the region is renewable storage and demand response. And again, there's a really interesting story in the details as to what that means for the portfolio. So this leads me to our third finding, which focuses on the increasingly significant role that we see solar and storage playing in supporting the region's needs in the future. So here we show the progression of what a typical summer peak day might look like from 2021 to 2025 if the utilities execute on their IRPs all the way out to 2033. Now, this is just one example of a peak day. Our simulations have thousands of these, but I think this one does a pretty good job of telling the story of what we see. Today, we have a relatively modest penetration of both solar and storage, and you can see that their impacts on overall regional net load are not especially large at this time. But as we move through time and utilities add larger and larger quantities of these resources, they work together to really effectively help meet summer peak day needs. The solar reduces net load in the middle of the day, and the storage comes on during that net peak and eventually later on into the evening to help meet load. So what you're seeing in action here is really the diversity benefit that we discussed up front, or that Adrian showed you in the ELCC slides. And these effects allow solar and storage plus wind and demand response to meet roughly 25% of the region's needs in 2025 and close to 50% of the needs in 2033. Now, of course, there's another part to this chart, and that's the gray area underneath all of these lovely, colorful resources. What this effectively represents is another piece of the puzzle that needs to be filled to ensure reliability as well. And what this represents to us is the region's remaining need for firm capacity resources that can be called upon to dispatch when needed and for sustained periods of time. So this brings me to our fourth key finding, which is that even as we grow our reliance on solar and storage, those firm resources that exist within the region will play a key role in ensuring reliability over the course of this transition. So the picture that you're looking at here is just another interesting way we found of slicing and dicing the data that comes out of a model like this. And what it shows you is how the timing of reliability risks in different hours of the day change over time. In 2021, what we see is that the period of highest risk spans from the late afternoon into the early evening. But by the time we're out in 2025, what you can see is that those hours of risk have actually really compressed and concentrated in that evening net peak period due to the presence of all the solar that's being added. If we step forward in time even further, we get to 2033, and you can see that the hours of risk have actually stretched out even longer into the evening and nighttime, and even circle back to the early morning hours. So we've really got an extended period of loss of load risk by the time we're out in the 2033 system. This is a direct consequence of the level of reliance on storage within this portfolio. So the reason I show you guys this picture is because it actually can tell us a lot about the types of resources that will provide most value to the system and what's needed for reliability. So for instance, in 2025, when we've shifted the risk into the net peak, solar no longer has a significant capacity value. It can't produce in those hours, and its marginal capacity value drops below 10%. By 2033, when the risk of loss of load spreads into the night and evening and even morning, we find that 4-hour storage, for instance, has significantly less capacity value at that point. At that point, its ELCC diminishes below 50%. In contrast to these two examples, firm resources that are able to produce electricity on demand for sustained periods, namely nuclear and natural gas, will remain highly valuable for their contributions to resource adequacy for this very reason. I will note that the finding of the importance of firm resources in maintaining reliability is a finding that's been common across many of the studies that we've done and that others have done in the space of resource adequacy. And this holds true even at higher levels of renewable penetration than we've examined in this study. So we view this finding as largely consistent with a growing body of literature on the resource adequacy needs of an increasingly low carbon electricity system. So now I'll turn to our final finding, one that's a little bit more abstract in nature, but maybe the most important for our audience here to keep in mind. And that is, even with the finding that the utilities IRP portfolios can meet an adequate level of reliability based on the assumptions we've made in this study, there are a number of risks that remain that could contribute to reliability issues within the region over the next decade. So I'll talk a little bit about each one of these. The first I want to highlight is the climate impacts. We've talked a little bit about this in the introduction, but just note we're in an era of unprecedented climatic uncertainty, and we know that historical weather can't be used to predict what future conditions may look like. Now, climate science can help here, but we must also acknowledge the limitation of models to predict the frequency and magnitudes of the types of tail events that will really drive our reliability risks. But even despite this uncertainty, we want to emphasize the importance of utilities taking advantage of the best and latest climate science has to offer when they're developing their future load forecasts. The second major risk to resource adequacy that I'll highlight is the uncertainty surrounding battery storage performance. Now, I'll preface this one by saying that in all of our work looking at deeply decarbonized energy systems, we anticipate an enormous role for battery storage as part of that deeply decarbonized future. And I think the utilities plans themselves share a similar view in the sense that we see in their plans over 13,000 megawatts of storage over the next decade. But we also have to acknowledge that in an assessment like this, in many respects, the assumptions we made we've made with respect to battery performance are somewhat idealized for a technology that we don't have much operating experience with. We have to acknowledge to ourselves that at this point, battery storage has not been widely deployed at grid scale, and that like many other new technologies, it may experience unexpected or unanticipated performance issues that limit its ability to be there when we need it most. We've already seen a couple examples of these types of things happen with facilities in the Southwest region and in California, where extreme heat has caused a number of battery facilities to fail under performance-related issues. And it's incumbent upon planners to consider the possibility that the new technology may not perform as idealized in a model like this. Now, these are issues that perhaps or hopefully time will solve as engineers and operators gain experience with new technology, but especially in the next 5 to 10 years before we have that real-world operating experience with these resources at scale, some amount of caution is warranted, and failure to consider this risk could result in unexpected capacity shortfalls. Third on our list is renewable variability. This is mainly an acknowledgement of the fact that with increasing reliance on wind and solar, the number of ways in which the weather impacts the reliability of the system increases. Now, we do our best in analysis like this to capture these dynamics, but we have to acknowledge as well that we rely on simulations and limited historical data sets when we do so. So we also have to acknowledge the imperfections in this data and be mindful of the risks of a system that's increasingly reliant on the weather. Fourth is the issue of fuel supply, which has already come up in one of the questions we got earlier. It's not a topic that we've analyzed quantitatively in this study, but we do recognize that past studies have highlighted this as a vulnerability to the region, and that the possible impacts of disruption of natural gas supply and delivery infrastructure could pose a risk to the region's reliability. Now, while events of a scale that would lead to regional reliability threats are very likely low in probability, it's nonetheless going to be an important risk to keep in mind in the next decade. And the last issue here that we've alluded to several times over the course of this presentation is the collection of risks associated with the timing of all the things that need to happen here to make this work. Timelines for new project development are measured in years and include many stages, from siting and permitting to competitive procurement processes, regulatory approval in some cases, and finally construction. And with the need for new resources increasing steadily on a year-by-year basis, any disruptions that can lead to delays or cancellations of projects could compromise the ability of the region to make this transition happen reliably. Excuse me. So with that thought in mind, I wanted to end this presentation by putting the decade ahead of us into a broader historical context. Really the only historical period in which we've seen a pace of new resource development that's comparable to what's needed in the next decade is in the few years that followed the Western energy crisis after 2001. But now what we're seeing is that the region, in order to maintain reliability, will need to sustain this pace of development over the course of the entire next decade. Essentially what we see is the need to add roughly 3,000 megawatts of nameplate capacity on a year-by-year basis every year within the region. And if at any point in this time horizon, the region fails to keep up with the necessary pace of development, the consequences will either be a degradation of reliability within the region or a need to retain some of the existing coal and natural gas plants beyond their expected retirement dates, neither of which I think is a favorable or desirable outcome. So what our analysis ultimately suggests then is that the major challenge facing the region for the next decade will be turning the plans that are written on paper today into steel on the ground. And this will require everybody involved in the related processes, from utilities to regulators to the stakeholders and developers, to work together to make the transition happen in a timely and efficient manner. So that's the end of the prepared material that we have for today. I know we have a little bit of time left for questions, so Arnie, I'll turn it over to you to manage the remaining time and our Q&As.
Great. Yeah, well, we'll try to get through all of the questions that are out there, but and I'll start with, there are about 10 questions maybe about the role of the market and the role of imports and what we assume there. Maybe there's maybe a narrow question about just the role of the market in general and whether the utilities have an open position. So maybe you could comment on that one first. But then secondly, about the role of the regional market, the role of imports potentially to help the Southwest, and the role of an RTO and how that might change this picture.
Okay, so that's a lot of questions rolled into one. I'll try to take them bit by bit, but you may have to remind me of all of those if I fail to hit on one of them. So one is that, we didn't conduct a detailed assessment of each utility's open position over the course of this analysis. This was really intended to be a regional view. I think what we can broadly say is that if the utilities are able to execute upon the plans as we see them here, as reflected in their IRPs, there won't be a significant open position for the region, in the sense that we see that these plans by themselves are able to put the region in a position where it's able to maintain its an acceptable level of reliability as defined by a 1-day in 10-year standard. Now, with respect to assumptions around imports and sort of market dynamics within the region, a couple observations on this. One is just a reminder for folks that within the context of this analysis, we've put all of the balancing authorities of the Southwest together and evaluated the potential for the loads and resources within that region to meet loads. We've evaluated the potential for resources within that region to meet loads across or throughout that region. So it is an implicit assumption already that even within the Southwest region, there's no transactional friction, and that there is an efficient enough market to facilitate sort of perfect sharing of resources to satisfy any needs that need to be met throughout the region. Now, because our focus here was on the Southwest region, the question we really intended to ask and to answer with this work was, how well suited are the resources within the Southwest region to meet the resource adequacy needs of that region? And so for that reason, most of the scenarios and sensitivities that we've investigated here haven't explicitly accounted for the possibility or the potential role of imports from neighboring regions. It was fundamentally kind of not the primary question we set out to answer. Now, we do include in this work, and this is another area where I'll point you to our report, several sensitivities in which we explore what possible role support or imports from neighboring regions might provide. And we find that, not surprisingly, if there is an ability to count on some level of imports, it only serves to improve the regional level of reliability that's achieved in the context of this work. But I'll just note along with that, that relying on neighboring regions, comes quite a bit of risk. And we know from our work in other jurisdictions that some of the daunting tasks in terms of new resources that are needed in the Southwest, the same thing is true in California, in Nevada, in other regions as well. Now, I think the final element of this question, if I recall correctly, was with respect to the future role of any sort of formalized pooling or capacity sharing within the broader West. And I know one topic that's probably on a lot of folks' minds in this respect is the future of the Western Resource Adequacy Program. We did not explicitly consider or think about the Western Resource Adequacy Program or anything like it in the context of this analysis. Again, it was mostly focused on how well do the utilities plans stack up against their individual needs. But I think there is a wide body of literature out there that indicates that there are economic benefits to capacity pooling and sharing across a broader region. And so it's a topic that I think certainly deserves more investigation and more study by the utilities. And I know that APS and SRP have publicly kind of announced their sort of intentions to explore the benefits of that. But I think it kind of remains to be seen what the benefits might look like. Did I get all the pieces of that question, Ernie?
Yep, I think you did. Yeah, maybe the one thing to emphasize there is that this really is a physical look at the resources in the Southwest region specifically. It doesn't really address market transactions, utilities buying and selling back and forth with each other. And as you said, the study shows that, in effect, if all the resources are built that the utilities are planning, then the region can stand on its own with respect to reliability without having to rely on its neighbors, which isn't to say that it might not be beneficial to them at some point to do that in a more organized framework. There's maybe a related question regarding the simplifying assumption of no transmission constraints and no friction in the Southwest region. How impactful is that simplifying assumption to the study?
Yeah, so I appreciate this question. I don't know that I can comment on any sort of quantitative assessment of how impactful it is, in the sense that if we had been able to do that, I could answer that very directly in the context of this study. We know that utilities within the region largely plan their transmission system and their transmission contracts to ensure that their own resources can be delivered to loads at the times they need them most, but it's certainly true that especially between systems, there may be congestion or periods of transmission constraints that interfere with that. Now, I think the transactional friction question is actually a really interesting one. And once again, this is one that's kind of difficult to quantify explicitly. But one of the dynamics that we anticipate seeing over the next decade or so as we see more and more storage is maybe a question as to how effectively a energy limited resource like energy storage might be shared among utilities. What I mean by that is that actually fundamentally there's an opportunity cost to sharing an energy storage resource. If I'm one utility and I have energy storage and my neighboring utility asks me for some energy, they need some of it, I'm not sure that I'm willing to share it if it means that I might potentially later on be putting my own system at risk. And so that's, I think, going to be an interesting dynamic to watch, is how effectively these types of energy limited resources might be shared, because it's certainly a different sort of paradigm from the era in which there was very little or no opportunity cost to sharing firm resources when you had a surplus available.
The next question is, have you compared your results and assumptions to the WEC probabilistic resource adequacy results for the Southwest?
Yeah, so thanks for this. We're I think pretty well aware of the work that WEC has done in this space, and I think as you saw at the outset of this presentation, we were actually lucky enough to have a couple folks from WEC, including Matt Elkins, who participated in our technical advisory panel. So we haven't had a chance to do maybe what you might say is a detailed line by line comparison of the two models, but we have had a bit of a chance to work together to reconcile or sort of add up some of what's different between these two things. I think where Matt and I came to in a recent conversation about this, and I certainly don't want to put words in his mouth, but where I felt like we were able to get to with sort of comparing what our two studies imply is that in many respects, these two studies are actually really similar in terms of what they imply for the region. Number one, that we are kind of today even right on the edge of load resource balance, and that sort of need for capacity will emerge very quickly if new resources are not added. And number two, that the amount of nameplate capacity that would be needed to close the gaps that we identify is actually a really substantial or a large number. So I think those two broad principles, the WEC study and this study, are both supportive of. With respect to exactly what side of the threshold of reliability those plans might land on would depend very specifically on the exact balance of loads and resources. And so we haven't been able to do that sort of line by line comparison.
Great. So next question is, the gross load looks identical for all of your scenarios. Have you looked at any non-technology solutions like time of use rates? Can we get people to consume in a way that better matches up with our variable generation, super off-peak rates to get EV owners to charge at night? And there's another related question, peak riders, TLU rates, charging ratepayers' behavior to shift demand enough to deal with expected peaks.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. It extends a little bit beyond the scope of the questions we were asked to look into, which was essentially, based on the utilities' projections of their own loads and their own resources, what do we expect the position to be within the region? And so in that respect, the scenarios that we've analyzed largely reflect the sort of utilities current planning with respect to all those types of demand side resources and demand side programs. But I think whoever asked this question is exactly right to point out all these types of programs as important future components of a solution to the region's or the utilities resource adequacy needs. We talk about this a little bit in the report, just the idea that there's a lot of space, a lot of ground potentially to be taken in terms of thoughtful rate design and program design that might help contribute to part of the solution. So those types of measures specifically are, again, a little bit beyond the scope of what we've done here, but I think it's a good direction to point utilities to try to maximize the value they can get from those programs to try to help address the growing need that we see.
Okay, now there were a few questions about the role of gas. The firm resources that we describe, are those just existing, or is there new gas that gets built between now and 2033? If so, how much? And what do our studies indicate about the way that the gas units will be utilized over time?
Yeah, I appreciate this question. I might back up to a slide that Adrian had showed you all. So as far as additions, there is a small amount of new natural gas capacity that's built in to these future scenarios. The exact number escapes me, but it's somewhere on the order of 1,500 megawatts of new natural gas capacity being added to the system over this time horizon in those IRP scenarios. With respect to the role of natural gas within the system, this is something that you can begin to get a picture of if you look at the annual generation mix on the far right. Essentially what we see over the course of the 10-year period that we've studied here is that the amount of natural gas generation when measured on an annual energy basis stays relatively consistent with the level that we see it today. Now, in some respects, I see this as kind of a remarkable result, just given the amount of load growth that we see within the region. What you can see is that the amount of renewables and other carbon-free resources in this portfolio are actually accounting for all of that load growth, plus even a little bit more as the coal plants retire. But we do see the natural gas resources within the study kind of continuing to provide really crucial reliability services to the region, but also contributing to meeting annual energy needs.
Great. So we're almost out of time. Well, I guess maybe just to clarify here that on the left-hand side, the chart does include projected retirements, correct?
Chart on the right includes projected retirements. Yes, all three charts do.
Okay, so we're just about out of time, so maybe I'll save this juicy question for last, and I apologize for the ones that we didn't get a chance to answer in the Q&A, but you are welcome to email us or contact us outside of this to get those questions answered. Last question, based on your analysis, what future risks keep you up at night?
I mean, in some respects, I think we've already kind of provided an answer to this question, but I think the biggest one, if I could call out one specifically, is just will we be able to execute? Will the region be able to execute on the plans that it's set forth for itself? The amount of capacity that we're looking at is, again, just really kind of unprecedented on a historical scale, and there's just a lot of work to be done to make this happen. It also, you might say, keeps me up at night just in the sense that that falling behind in this could have cascading implications that last for a potentially not just a single year, but multiple years, in the sense that once you fall a little bit behind, it becomes successively more and more difficult to catch back up. And so we could see that if we do fall behind, there could be cascading implications that last not just a single year, but multiple years as project development kind of lags behind need. So that's a very real risk that I see. The other risks that we've listed here, I also feel are very real and important to keep in mind in planning. And there may be others beyond this as well, but this is what's on my radar. So So I think that puts us at time. Really appreciate, once again, everybody being able to join us for this webinar. And once again, we'll find a way to blast out to you guys all links to the slides that we've shared today and the final report. But you can also find that final report on our website under the publications section. It should be up there as of this morning. So as Arnie said, feel free to reach out with any questions or comments or feedback that you might have. My email is just nick@e3.com. So even if you don't write that down, it's easy to remember, and happy to engage more on this work, which we've had a really fun time doing. And we're once again really happy to share with you all. So thanks, everyone. And with that, we will end the webinar.